now for something completely different. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First, a word of thanks to the organizers for accepting my paper, which after all will be a bit out of the ordinary, in that I will not be talking about commercial recordings, but about the unique historical recordings of the Phonogrammarchiv. Now, as you might have guessed, the title of my paper is a pun. First, of course, it quite literally refers to people grouped around the horn of a phonograph, as in this photograph from Greenland, which I will come back to later. But then it also refers to that wonderful BBC radio show from the golden age of British comedy, which has been voted the best radio comedy series of the BBC, Round the Horn, named after Kenneth Horne here at the centre. And finally, I meant to illustrate the fact that some of our earliest recordings come from Brazil in South America, with Cape Horn at its southern tip. Now, as you may know, the Phonogrammarchiv of the Austrian Academy of Sciences is this year celebrating its 125th anniversary. It was founded on the 27th of April, 1899, when the eminent physiologist Sigmund Exner and 5 other members of what was then the Imperial Academy of Sciences in Vienna brought forward the motion for the establishment of some kind of phonographic archive. This was to become the world's first sound archive. Even Paris, where similar ideas had been in the air, eventually acknowledged Vienna's pioneering role. Subsequently, sound archives were also set up elsewhere in Europe, in Berlin, St. Petersburg and Zurich, for example. According to Exner, who was the guiding spirit and long-time director of the Phonogrammarchiv, the objectives of such a sound archive were to systematically produce, collect and preserve phonographic recordings of, first, European languages and dialects, but ultimately of languages from all over the world. Second, music, chiefly that of indigenous peoples. And third, famous personalities of the day, resulting in so-called Stimmporträts or voice portraits. Over the years, this was accomplished by providing mainly Austrian researchers and expeditions with the necessary equipment, as well as technical and methodological advice. In return, they deposited their recordings in the archive. The holdings of the Phonogrammarchiv thus consist chiefly of unique field recordings made in the course of research projects, as opposed to recordings produced for commercial purposes. They come from all disciplines and regions, with a focus on ethnomusicology and linguistics and dialectology. Geographically speaking, the lion's share is of European origin. Africa and Asia are equally well represented, while North and South America are surprisingly underrepresented. Now some basic facts and figures about our historical recordings made between 1899 and roughly 1950, before the introduction of tape recording. So here is an overview of the various formats, and altogether they amount to some 200 hours. So we've got the so-called Phonogramme, which result from recordings on wax discs. Then we've got instantaneous discs, especially lacquer and acetate discs, replicated coarse groove discs, some wire recordings, and wax cylinders. In the two collections, the main collection and the so-called special collection. In my paper, I will only talk about our so-called Phonogramme, but I should like to point out that among the shellac discs in our collection, there is, for example, the almost complete set of 171 recordings made in the course of the famous Congress of Arab Music held in Cairo in 1932, otherwise only to be found in Paris and London, as far as I know. They entered the Phonogrammarchiv through the good offices of Egon Welles himself, one of the participants, and here is his signature in our visitor's book. As for our 200 or so wax cylinders, it is interesting to note that the archive's first technician, Fritz Hauser, developed a machine for copying Edison cylinders onto the discs of the Archivphonograph. For this reason, we have occasionally got copies of cylinders kept in the Phonogrammarchiv in Berlin, for example. But let us now focus on our Phonogramme, which are at the heart of our historical collections. When the Phonogrammarchiv was founded in 1899, there were two recording and reproduction techniques available. There was, of course, Edison's phonograph, easy to transport and hence ideal for field research, but at the beginning, the major disadvantage was that it was initially impossible to produce good quality copies. And then we've got Berliner's gramophone, which was not ideal for recordings in the field. So therefore, the recording and reproduction technique developed by the Phonogrammarchiv's technician Fritz Hauser was a combination of both techniques. The sound was recorded by the so-called Archivphonograph in Edison's vertical cut technique on a wax disc, the so-called phonogram, from which a nickel-plated copper negative was taken, which then served as the master for any number of archive discs. And it was the possibility of such copying and hence the preservation of the quality of the original recording that proved an important prerequisite for both the institution of an archive and any further study. Unfortunately, almost all these archive discs were destroyed during the bombing in World War II, but luckily the negatives survived, and it is the new casts made from epoxy resin in the early 1960s that are being digitized for our ongoing edition of the historical collections. And here at the bottom you can see the three different types: the original wax disc or the archive disc, then the master metal, and the new cast. Early field researchers were faced with two major problems. First, the limited duration of recordings, which on average was only about 2 minutes. So the continuous recordings of songs with several stanzas was thus impossible. And second, above all, the heavy weight of the Archivphonograph. Type 1 alone weighed about 35 kilos. And if we add all the accompanying boxes of equipment, as you can see in the the photograph, researchers had to deal with some 120 kilos. So here's František Pospíšil in South Moravia in 1910, recording folk songs and other things. So often the people to be recorded had to be brought to the hotel where the phonograph was set up, and not the other way around. So the construction of type 5 was a relief with its 9.5 kilograms. Over 4,000 or so historical recordings from our main collection. They were made between 1899 and 1950, and they preserve unique and occasionally lost cultural heritage. Consequently, in 1999, so 25 years ago, they were included by UNESCO as documents of universal significance in the Memory of the World Register. And the idea was conceived to publish all of them, which was a novelty in those days. Since 1999, 18 series have appeared on CD, and they feature quite prominently in a brochure of our publications, which you can take away. I've got them here. Since the CD is, however, becoming somewhat obsolete, an online edition on the basis of a new concept devised by my colleague Conny Gruber is currently in the making. The main objectives of this annotated source edition so far have been several important issues: contextualization, interpretation, source critical analysis, then providing the basis for future research and easy accessibility, dissemination, and becoming ever more important, repatriation and recirculation. And as you can see in this diagram, our edition not only makes accessible the digitized recordings, but has also it also includes scans of the original documentation, scholarly commentaries, and transcriptions and translations. So here is an overview of the 18 series published so far. In my talk, I will briefly introduce you to some of them. Regrettably, for reasons of time, I will have to cut short and sometimes even omit the audio samples. But still, in this list, blue signifies exclusively or predominantly recordings of music, and red exclusively or predominantly recordings of language. The rest is of mixed contents. So these are some of the series dealing with European topics, but field research was also carried out outside Europe, in Africa, Asia, North, South America, and Oceania, so everywhere apart from Antarctica. The earliest field recordings, still extant, were made in 1890 by the American anthropologist Jesse Walter Fuchs when studying the Passamaquoddy, a Native American people in northeastern North America. And in his prophetic remark, echoing the salvage paradigm, he underlines the importance of the phonograph in the preservation of what today we would call intangible cultural heritage. The oldest field recording in the Phonogrammarchiv was made 11 years later in 1901, which was the year when the newly developed Archiv phonograph was to be tested under field conditions in the course of 3 expeditions. The first of them was conducted by Milan Reshetar, a member of the Academy's Balkans Commission and professor of Slavic philology in Vienna, who wanted to study the dialect boundaries in Croatia and Slavonia. So the value of the recordings deposited by researchers in the Phonogrammarchiv crucially depends on the detailed documentation they were requested to provide, the so-called protocols, we translate them. And so here is the protocol of our very first field recording, a folk tale recorded on the 20th of May 1901 in Bjelovar near Zagreb. As you can see, it is divided into a header and a free text section. The header contains standardized information such as personal data of the person recorded, location and date of the recording, a brief indication of contents, technical details, as well as the phonographer's name and profession. The free text section underneath contains a transcription and often also a translation. Quite interesting is the fact that Reshetar recorded more or less on the way a folk tale in Romany. Little did he know that this was to become the oldest known sound document of the language of the Roma extant in Austria and perhaps the whole world. And just a few seconds of this. Despite all the problems that Reshetar encountered, he recognized the importance of the new medium and ends on a positive note, saying that especially for linguistic studies, the phonograph has a great future, allowing to record and preserve for all time the ever-changing human languages and dialects, some of which are also on the verge of extinction. The Academy's second expedition of 1901 takes us across the Atlantic to southern Brazil. It was led by Richard Wettstein, professor of systematic botany at the University of Vienna and director of the Botanical Gardens. It was primarily devoted to botanical studies, but the Phonogrammarchiv jumped at the opportunity and equipped the team with a phonograph. The expedition was a huge success. Over 300 photographs and some 5,000 plants were taken back to Vienna, but also 9 recordings made in Sao Paulo. They represent not only the first recordings of the language of the indigenous Guarani, but actually the oldest sound documents from the whole of Brazil. Guarani is today Paraguay's second official language and spoken by some 5 million people. So here is the beginning of one of the word lists he recorded. The last of the 3 expeditions of 1901 was undertaken in the Ottoman Empire on the island of Lesbos in today's Greece. The Berlin Indo-Europeanist Paul Kretschmer, professor of comparative linguistics at the University of Vienna, had been asked by the Academy's Balkans Commission to research modern Greek dialects. So Kretschmer not only collected various dialect samples, fairy tales and proverbs, but was also able to record 3 songs in Mytilene, the capital of the island. Sung by a precentor, a professional singer in church, they are not folk songs, but rather composed songs originating in an urban environment, and probably represent the oldest sound documents of modern Greek produced for scientific purposes. The oldest Greek commercial recordings on discs were made in 1896 in Berliner's laboratories in Washington, D.C., as we learn from Hugo Strötbaum's article in volume 12 of the Contributions to the History of the Record Industry. Let us just listen to the first few seconds of this song recorded by Kretschmer. Right. Between 1904 and 1905, another expedition, this time devoted to meteorological investigations in India, was equipped with an Archivphonograph. It was led by Sigmund Exner's son Felix, who was advised also to make recordings in the hope that they would provide valuable information on the meter and pronunciation of Sanskrit. Consequently, the 68 Phonogramme mainly contain Sanskrit recitations, for example from the Vedas, the collection of religious orally transmitted texts, or from epics such as the Mahabharata. More than half of them took place through the offices of Henry Steele Olcott, the co-founder and first president of the Theosophical Society, in the Society's Adyar Library in Madras, today's Chennai, which was where presumably this wonderful photograph with the palm leaf manuscripts was taken. During their visit to the library, the delegation and the phonograph were greeted with the following words in Sanskrit. Yes, etc. The collection also contains an invocational text recited in Malayalam, and I think we've got a speaker here tomorrow who will talk about Malayalam recordings, and according to his abstract, by 1911 only 12 songs had been recorded, so our phonogram must be one of the first sound documents in that language. Now to Africa. A highly controversial figure in the history of early phonographic field research is Rudolf Pöch, the physician and anthropologist who, after working as an assistant at the Phonogrammarchiv, became the holder of the first chair of anthropology and ethnography at the University of Vienna. He also advocated the use of the phonograph, and during several expeditions also used an Edison phonograph, as well as our Archivphonograph, and took with him also a photo and film camera. In the course of 3 major research projects between 1904 and 1916, he managed to enrich the archive's holdings by some 250 recordings, but his methods, which included anthropometric research in Austro-Hungarian prisoner of war camps and even body snatching in Africa, are of course quite unacceptable, as also revealed in a book with the telling title Skeletons in the Cupboard. A few words now about Rudolf Pöch's primarily anthropological and ethnographic expedition to the Kalahari, in the course of which he made recordings of the indigenous population in today's Botswana and Namibia, as well as photographs such as this one, as you can see here. Note the use of paper to enlarge the horn of the Archivphonograph and the use of so-called ear hoses, Hörschläuche, which remind us of modern earphones. The 67 Phonogramme comprise not only the first recordings of Khoisan languages with their typical clicks, but possibly also the oldest sound documents of polyphony of the Khoisan-speaking peoples in the southwest of Africa. Here, just a few seconds. In addition to Rudolf Pöch, there is another person from the early days of the Phonogrammarchiv to whom we owe also a large number of sound recordings, Rudolf Trebitsch. Born as the son of a wealthy silk manufacturer, he graduated as a medical doctor, but hardly ever practiced his profession. Instead, he was more interested in the study of ethnography, where he achieved his second doctorate. Between 1906 and 1913, he undertook a series of entirely self-financed travels, chiefly in order to preserve, with the help of the phonograph, languages on the verge of extinction. This resulted not only in 262 recordings featuring folk songs and tales, legends, poems, instrumental music, etc., but also in a huge collection of numerous objects of ethnographic interest. The destination of his first expedition was West Greenland. It resulted in 73 phonogramme, which, together with the recordings from East Greenland made by the Danish linguist William Thalbitzer, represent the oldest sound documents extant of the Greenlandic Inuit. The illustrations in the subsequent publication depict some of the people recorded, And here is one of several recordings featuring a variant of the traditional drum songs, which involved men and women singing and forming a circle around a dancer and drummer. They probably represent the only surviving recordings of this kind of performance, which usually took place at night so that the missionaries who disapproved of all traditional singing would not notice. Here a few seconds of the women who were singing while the men accompanied them with rhythmic shouts and some faint drumming. Right, let me finally present two examples from the third major group of recordings mentioned in the founding motion alongside language and music, the so-called voice portraits. Since Inya's paper later today will also deal with Alfred Grünfeld, I thought we'd let him speak to us first. Grünfeld, who described himself in the protocol as a piano virtuoso and composer, was the most popular pianist of Viennese high society at the time. We see him here at the Bösendorfer grand piano in his Viennese flat, and his virtuosity at the piano seems to have been the subject of numerous caricatures. Moreover, he worked as a music teacher at the new Vienna Conservatory, and his teaching activities are probably also reflected in his voice portrait.
Mein musikalischer Wahlspruch, der Rhythmus, wäre der Musik. Worauf ich auch besonderen Wert lege beim Klavierspiel, was ich allen verpflichten würde und wüsste, ist das richtige Pedalisieren. Leider wird das nicht genügend haben.
As you know, there are also numerous recordings of Grünfeld's piano playing, as he was one of the first pianists to make immediate use of the latest recording techniques. So in 1889 he recorded 2 wax cylinders for the Edison Company, and from 1899 he made disc recordings for the Deutsche Grammophongesellschaft, where his brother was conveniently the recording manager. To conclude, here is the crowning finale, as it were. On the 2nd of August 1903, Sigmund Exner succeeded in making a recording which was meant to attract public attention to the activities of the Phonogrammarchiv. I'm, of course, referring to the longest of the 3 recordings of the voice of Emperor Franz Joseph, whom Exner and Hauser visited himself for half an hour in his summer residence in Ischl. The Emperor was recorded on 3 discs, which in honor of His Majesty subsequently received the numbers 1, 2, and 3. The text had been prepared in advance and was actually prompted to him, but on the 3rd disc the Emperor added a sentence off the cuff, starting with one of his famous standard phrases.
Hat mich sehr gefreut, auf Wunsch der Akademie der Wissenschaften meine Stimme in den Apparat hineinzusprechen und dieselbe dadurch Versammlung einzuverleihen.
Right, thank you very much for your patience.